Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I know every one of you could tell a very similar story to what we're telling. It's a great hobby, and it's really influenced my life. And like Steve said, when you're working in something that you love, it's really not work. So ham radio has been that way for me. The way I got started, I'm 62 years old, by the way. I was born in 1960, so as a kid I came up through the Apollo space race, which really influenced me and an entire generation of Americans. And when I was 5 years old, I went to my grandpa's house in Brooklyn, New York, and he had this really old 1926 shortwave radio, big as furniture, hung on the wall. And I would tune around and hear these signals. I'd hear single sideband that sounded like Donald Duck, and Morse code, and it was fascinating. And so every year we'd go back to Grandpa Carl's house, I'd tune that radio. I didn't understand it, but I knew I loved it. And I was captivated at the age of 5. And at age 8, he gave me a CB radio, an old tube-type CB radio. I didn't know about crystals, so I could never hear anything on it but static, because it didn't have any crystals. But I was 8 years old and didn't know that, so I'd try to key the mic and always hoping to find people, putting wires in the back and getting shocked. Great for an 8-year-old. And I never knew what was going on. And then when I got to be 12 years old, I got into walkie-talkies. And I'd go to the Western Auto Hardware store, and my buddies and I would put batteries in parallel and series. We learned about that, and we'd hook wires up, and we'd talk to the truckers out on the interstate 3 miles away with, these 100 milliwatt walkie-talkies. So I loved wireless, and I was reading about it. And then I think the best break of my life occurred when I was a teenager. I was just starting freshman year of high school, and I was a pretty good athlete, and I was going to be playing football on the football team. And all the kids on the football team, we were in Indiana. Actually, I grew up not too far from here in high school, just over the border, Richmond, Cambridge City, Indiana. And I was in this terrible football accident. I went up to catch a pass, and we weren't playing with pads. It was before the season, and I was hit at the same time above and below my knee. So I had a horrible fracture in my left leg. In fact, the doctors wondered if I'd ever walk or play sports again. It's the best break in my life, because I was in a body cast for 6 months at age 13, 14, and all I could do is lay there for 6 months like a mummy in paper mache. And it was my grandma who sent me a shortwave radio. I listened to that radio every day, every night, heard HCJB, the Deutsche Welle, Radio Moscow, and I learned about ham radio over shortwave, and I taught myself Morse code because I was definitely inspired to get my ham radio license. And I played a cassette tape back to myself of my own voice doing beep, 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 beep on a cassette tape. I got out of the body cast and had some mentors in Cambridge City, Indiana, and I got my ham license. And I went to Purdue. I hitchhiked to Purdue because I was very poor. And I was lucky to be there right at the beginning of the cellular telephone revolution. And the professors at Purdue encouraged me to go into wireless because cellular phones hadn't come out. This is 1978. And so I got my undergraduate degree and stayed for graduate school and was involved in W9YB, the Ham Radio Club. There are several people here today who are friends of mine, lifelong friends, who are there in the club with me. And I started writing articles because as a researcher, you had to publish. So I started writing in the ham radio magazines when I was a graduate student. And I invented an antenna so I could get on top band from my own dorm apartment at Purdue. And this antenna allowed me to put up basically a stealth, very low wire. I published it in ham radio. And then when the FCC allowed spread spectrum, which led to Wi-Fi, I wrote an article about spread spectrum for the ham radio community. Little did I know that this was going to help start the Wi-Fi revolution, which a couple years later I was actually able to be a part of. I was part of the founding team that developed the Wi-Fi standard when I took a job at Virginia Tech. Nathaniel, you were a few years after I left, but I was actually at Virginia Tech working with the first 802.11 and 802.4L committees to build the Wi-Fi standards, because my research at Purdue University had measured factory buildings for the first time ever to figure out what the signal strengths and multipath could be in factories. And that was the original genesis, the motivation for Wi-Fi. It was to computerize and automate factory buildings. Today we have it in all our cell phones, but it was originally aimed at automating the workplace and factories in particular. So my research on the factory of the future fit right in to where wireless was going. Of course, I didn't know that then. I was fortunate, though, to be one of the first professors in the world to start teaching the field of wireless communications. I knew there'd be a need for engineers. My graduate school experience and my ham radio experience of building transmitters and receivers was perfect for producing knowledge of how the radio channels would be for 1G, 2G, first generation, second generation, third generation, 4G, and now fifth generation cell phone. Anyway, along the way, I used a ham radio receiver to build a cellular intercept product, a cell phone intercept product, because the government came to me and said, Ted, you're a wireless guy. We want to intercept signals around the world. So I actually got a couple students. We built really probably the first software-defined radio, which allowed cellular and paging signals to be intercepted over the air in the early 1990s. I had a chance to actually go out with law enforcement and rescue to save people in the early days of cell phone direction finding. In fact, my product, CellScope and Page Tracker, became very famous because it was not only used by the early cellular industry, but it was also used by law enforcement. In fact, it made it into the movies. Here's a couple clips at this point in my career. So Nathaniel and Marty, I want you to really enjoy it while you're young. Life is really great. I was inducted into the Radio Club of America with Fred Link, who is the president of the Radio Club of America. It's here at Dayton. You should go check out the RCA. It's the world's oldest radio society, founded by teenagers in 1909. And he was the president of the club, and he was a pioneer in land mobile radio. It was my background in ham radio that allowed me to do everything I was doing, and they recognized me and brought me into that society. I've met so many wonderful people. The inventor of the walkie-talkie, Walter Cronkite, who was a ham. So many ham radio operators who all, just like all of us in this room, share this love of what we do. So fast forward to about 10 years ago, I worked with a bunch of students to do ham radio again, but this time at frequencies much higher than anyone ever thought cell phone could work. This is up at millimeter wave, 28 and 60 gigahertz, when all our cell phones over the last 40 years, first generation to 4G, fourth generation, all operate below 6 gigahertz. I had this idea that we could go up much higher in frequency to bring much wider bandwidth channels, which would bring much more capacity. But the world didn't believe me. So I just played ham radio with all these great students. We built transmitters and receivers with directional antennas, went to the streets of New York City, proved that it can work better than the first 4 generations of cellular. The world was very skeptical. But being a professor and being a ham who had built these things, earned a lot of trust, and in fact, we published this paper in 2013, which started the 5G standard for the world. And now all of the cell phones that are made today have this new 5G millimeter wave band based on research. So in summary, I've basically been playing ham radio all my life. This is one of the journal papers that led to the fixed wireless access that we all use today in rural and city 5G. Fixed wireless access is replacing cable and fiber. The data rates are that high. So in conclusion, I kind of pinch myself every day. I still feel like that 5-year-old listening to the Philco radio, and I've had this career where I get to work with so many amazing young students and so many great companies who have sponsored my research and hire the students. So those of you who are young, enjoy it while you've got it and be fearless, and really glad you could be here and have a great Dayton. Thank you.
Yep, Ted, fill them in.
I got to say one more thing. It was the Foundation of Amateur Radio and the ARRL Radio Club of America that gave me a scholarship when I was 21 and just graduating with my undergrad that kept me as a grad student to Purdue. So ham radio actually kept me going to college. Thank you.